welcome to ABA Inside Track Summer 2023 Book Club. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous book buddies.
Hey, Rob. It's me, Diana.
And it's me, your furry pal, Jackie.
And it's me, your non-musical pal, Alan.
Alan, you're like the Bert to me, but not in the Bert and Ernie sense. You're just Bert, and I'm Grover.
Hey, Bert.
Okay, we're just different Muppets.
Yeah, in the 70s, I listened to a record, and Bert was in the bathtub for the entire time. Ernie just invaded his bath space.
Oh, I love
Do you remember that one?
It's like a theater of the mind kind of.
Yeah, he walked in, and he's like, I'm in the bathtub, Ernie. And I love that he just theoretically was naked the entire time that, like, the Michigan University marching band came into their bathroom.
Okay. So that's
I'm definitely the Ernie to Rob's Bert, I would say.
Yeah. What, really? I'm not the Ernie?
I'm the messy one.
Well, you're messy. That's true. What?
You collect a lot of things.
I collect like paper clips and whatnot. Anyway, this is our, as I said at the top, Summer 2023 Book Club for patrons. So if you're hearing this and you're not a patron, it's far in the future. And we already recorded this and we're doing a different book at this point. But you can still enjoy.
In utopia in 2024.
Yeah, you can still enjoy what we thought about our book a year ago. Still have fun with that. But if you are a patron, you're listening to this in the year 2023, we thank you so very much for doing so. We are going to talk about a book that was voted on by listeners, and that is B.F. Skinner's Walden Two. This was originally was supposed to be fun books that we'll enjoy, and maybe that Diana already read, so she could get the summer off a little bit. And then the listeners chose the one book she had not read from the list.
But the book I read.
But Jackie had read it.
Yeah, it worked out for Jackie.
I've read it multiple times.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking all about Walden 2. And why don't we just start with that? So who had read this book before this book club assignment?
I have read this book multiple times in various iterations of my life. This is one of the books that I read before I got into behavior analysis. And I think vastly differently about it now than I did then. And then I usually keep it by my bedside along with The Science of Human Behavior and read them when I'm trying to fall asleep at night if I can't fall asleep after my regular book, because it usually only takes 1 or 2 pages.
Ouch. Take that, B.F. Skinner.
But if you are one thing I noticed again while like looking through the book this time is if you have read a lot of B.F. Skinner, his writing doesn't change from the literary B.F. Skinner to the scientific B.F. Skinner. And I think that's a downfall of the book.
Well, as a piece of fiction.
Of literature, right? But I do have another thing that I want to say later about it.
Okay. Well, we got about 2 hours.
Good.
So
you'll have a chance to do so.
And Alan, how about you? I had not read this book before this. Had you read it before?
I definitely had read parts of it. I think back when I was in college, like a long time ago, before I knew I was even going to enter this field, because I found parts of it familiar, and then I realized I had read a section of this and then a section of Kuhlman's like Living Walden Two, which is like 2000, by the time I was in college, so it was a big deal, like sort of investigation, examination of that, and they even mentioned the Skinnerian little like utopia commune in Mexico and everything. So
Comunidades Los Horcones.
Yeah. So I definitely had found parts of it. I was like, oh yeah, I definitely have read this. But reading it all the way through, this was definitely my first time.
All right.
I much prefer his later work after some people have basically told him to stick to science, and then he's kind of like defeated and refined and sticks to a more like philosophical and psychological lens, because this is kind of a lot to slog through.
Mm-hmm. All right. So
we all know I hadn't read it.
We all know Diana had not read. Her plan backfired, and she had to read a different book. But hopefully she enjoyed it. We'll find out, won't we? So we're going to start kind of by talking a little bit about the book, some of the context of when it was written, some initial thoughts, and then in the back half we'll get into more of the more detailed sort of review and our own sort of analysis here. So there were a couple other pieces that I thought were interesting. Alan, you mentioned the Kuhlman Living Walden 2 book, which I did not read. I read an article. I don't remember where I got the article. It was sort of like a review of Living Walden 2, as I did not have time to read Living Walden 2, plus this book, plus everything else. So, but that did seem like a very interesting review of sort of what real life Walden 2-esque communities had come up. I think there were two big ones that sort of came up in the 70s. Then there were two other pieces that I thought were really interesting. I don't know if anyone kind of like caught these, if they were doing any like Google searches, but there was a really good Behavior Analyst article from 2009 by Altus and Morris, B.F. Skinner's Utopian Vision Behind and Beyond Walden 2, which I know I took a couple notes from just in terms of its doing a lot of, I think, what we were planning to talk about, which is this book was written so long ago, way before, ADA, and what does it mean, if anything, to modern behavior analysts, most of whom are practicing within the applied field. And I thought that book was really good. So I'll try to mention when I have ideas that sound really great that I kind of just were like, they was in this article. So rather than everyone thinking it was my good idea, it wasn't. It was theirs. And I also found a really great New York Times article from March 15th, 1970 by Richard Todd called Walden 2, 3, Many More, which was just a great review of, where Walden 2 sat at the time. So 50 years ago now, it's a long time ago, but it had a lot of quotes and interview with B.F. Skinner that added a lot of extra context. That was just really, really fascinating. And then it also looked a little bit at the types of communities that were trying to do Walden 2s and really sort of reflecting on, I think, a lot of the malaise that was going on in the 70s that honestly, and, your context will vary. I think a lot of the same malaise that was going on in the 70s does feel like it's permeating some of what's going on in at least American culture these days. It's not exactly a one-to-one correspondence, but a lot of sense of just things aren't right and we're not quite sure what to do about some of those things. And again, I think your mileage will vary in terms of how you feel about that. But I think this is a really good time, at least for me personally, it was a really good time to be reading Walden 2 because I am going through my own sort of crisis of what's going on in life and am I happy about how things are going in, personal life, in real life. Mostly personal life is fine, but like in the general way things are going, I think, in society. And a lot of those things are really making me personally think there's got to be a better way almost every day. And it was really interesting reading Walden 2 with that mindset. I don't think I would have enjoyed this book at all had I read it maybe in like my 20s or early 30s, but I found myself really liking it this time, at this point in my life, not this time through, because it was the first time I had read it. So why don't we just start real quick with Around the Horn, like your first thoughts on the book, then we'll talk a little bit about how it was written and go on. So in general, Jag, I know you really love this book, but you have some qualms with it each time you read it, or your qualms change over time?
Yeah, so overall I like the idea of the book. Mm-hmm. I like the idea that everyone can be taken care of in their own way and how they all see fit. I don't see how that could actually happen in real life, but I like the ideal, like when everyone can come as they are, and be part of a community. I like the idea of communal living. I think I would really jazz in a communal living situation, right? With my own room.
You could do, I think I could see you being in a communal living space and then you get your own private space sometimes. Most of the time you're doing and sharing. I could see you really enjoying that.
I think I'd really love it. I have a friend that lives in Boston that lives in a communal living house where they have their own bedrooms and bathrooms, but the living room and like all the kitchen is all shared space. Mm-hmm. And I always like going to visit her. You have to really like the people that you're in there with, though, right? Because then obviously it turns horrible. But
and they're not products of Walden 2's social engineering. So
no, so it's just the communal living. I think I really like that aspect. I like the aspect of like changing your career often. Mm-hmm. Like if you depending on the season, like changing what you do for work. I kind of like that idea. And that's one of the things that appealed to me about Walden 2. It's like, I could be a professor in the fall, but in the winter, I could shift my focus and do more inward work.
Jackie, they're not going to give you any credits for being a professor. This is a pretty anti-professor book.
Right.
You at best might be able to get the stage for an hour lecture just to entertain the folks.
Multiple times, though. Right?
As many times as you want to.
As many times I want to. So I like that idea because I think a lot of people get into a job and then they have to stay in that job even if they don't like it because they're living paycheck to paycheck. So I like that idea of being able to move more seamlessly through jobs, although I don't know how that would work, right? When you think about it, like I'm not sure how that would work seamlessly. And when we get to the childcare portion, I do not like that one.
That one
will bring that one out. That was a huge, big red flag for me. And the construct of like female and male and child rearing and birthing.
Mm-hmm.
Like women could start having kids at 16 if they want to.
Mm-hmm.
Not really quite into that, but we'll get there. And how that part of the book I found fascinating. And I'm wondering, here's what I want to think. I'm wondering when Skinner wrote this book, if he is both Frasier and Burrus.
Yes.
Right? Like, I love that.
Yes, he is. And he mentioned actually in the Times piece that he wrote it as sort of a self-therapy.
Oh,
so
man.
He is both characters.
Because I could see the Frasier guy. I didn't even know that.
Well,
I didn't even read
thank you,
Times
Richard Todd.
Piece. Didn't even read the Times piece. But that's what when I read it, I was like, oh, I can see Skinner in the Frasier. Like, that is how he is.
Yeah.
Scientifically, right? Boring, flat.
A jerk
in a way, but he doesn't really mean to be a jerk. He's just scientifically minded and not unempathetic.
He's not checking his privilege, that's for sure.
That is definitely true.
Definitely true.
Yeah, definitely not checking his privilege.
All right.
Alan,
anyway. What about you? Like, kind of an initial, overall, like, general summary of feelings about the book.
Well, I just want to make sure I read the 76 when he revisited it.
Yes.
And did the update just to make sure.
We all did.
Yeah, we all did.
Good call, Alan. Yes, you should be reading. If you are reading an original copy of Walden Two, put it down, put it on your shelf. That's a collector's item. Go buy the revisited one, which is just you could get as like a fancy paperback, or like Diana has.
50 years old. The reissue.
The reissue is only 50 years old, but you can get updated printings. But you can get the one Diana has, which is actually from the local high school library of my hometown.
It's rejected, apparently.
Framingham, Mass. And they threw it out, and now it's in Diana's library.
Never checked out.
No one checked it out.
No one ever checked this book out. I have the library card. It is blank.
Or it was so checked out that they kept having to put new ones in, and they finally stopped because they switched to digital.
Maybe that's it.
Well, no, so I just like to do that because his preface where he talks about rewriting it and is kind of looking back 30 years later is helpful, I think.
Agree.
Yes.
And understanding his mindset, because it's also, I don't think he distances himself from it exactly, but he definitely puts a little, this was me 30 years ago, and I've been educated in that time. So I think that definitely helps with the revulsion I feel for a lot of the actual content. When it comes,
we're behavior analysts, so we should allow anyone to grow and change.
Yeah, exactly. And I wasn't sure when we were going to talk about the historical context, which I can refrain from that at the moment. But I just thinking about when this was written, just some of the highlights that are important, like Piaget, Erikson coming from special ed, bigger names in education theory, child development, they're writing at the same time. He's writing kind of in the dark about a lot of things, probably. There aren't sort of, you have to acknowledge this stuff. This is a big conversation, especially 1945 when he's writing this. And then thinking about, it's interesting. He has a bit of a anarcho-communist bent in some of his idealism. So I think it's interesting. He doesn't ever say from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, that kind of thing. But definitely has that vibe. But I think it's interesting because he does kind of have we're a blank slate approach to human development. But again, genetics doesn't really exist at this point. People haven't really rediscovered Mendel's works when he's writing this. Right. So biology and our understanding of just how organisms grow just isn't there.
Eugenics was in existence.
Yes.
Yeah, eugenics definitely was. But I should say modern concepts of like the genome and everything just isn't there. So yeah, I mean, definitely has the the eugenics vibes, especially that I think that's why the child development portion is so
gross,
sketchy
horrible.
and gross, horrible,
Yeah.
is because it does seem very eugenicsy of just like, well, let's make sure people don't raise their own children. That's kind of gross. So yeah, and again, I say these things not to sort of forgive him, but to say he really was like in the dark about what a lot of things that we take to be good and established, or at least worth addressing as modern behaviorists. So, but yeah,
it's also a book of fiction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right,
It
like
is, but it's a philosophical work. Like, I don't know, like I think people love Plato's Republic, but it's a horrible fascistic system, and his system does not improve upon that in any way. It's just a little more behaviorist. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this based on the sum of my background. Plus, yeah, just thinking about like he has very gendered roles,
gendered
roles, which again for the time, you know, that wasn't, I guess, in the conversation, but I think it actually was. It wasn't him being intransigent on it. It was just him just being like, oh, well, this is just how it is and kind of how it ought to be. So we just don't have a great distinction of a lot of things. So like, I don't think this is good representation of Skinner like ideas. I think it's good to go back and reread it and be like, okay, this is what's problematic about Skinner, and anything I don't appreciate about verbal behavior and the science of human behavior, this can help inform your reading of those, but not my favorite book.
And Dan, I think you had kind of a similar vibe from it than Alan did, I think, as you were kind of mentioning the other day.
Yeah, of course, Alan is able to word these things much more clearly than I am.
You were just going to do 1 star, arrived damaged in box.
Yeah, I shared a lot of the same concerns that Alan did. The book feels very, to me, old and outdated, but also, I don't know, like, I had a hard time, even if I were to try to say, like, let's use this. Let's say we like it and we want to use it as a roadmap for creating a society. I couldn't tell what to do.
No, I couldn't tell what to do either. Yeah, right. If you're gonna use this as like a treatment plan, it's not helpful.
I really couldn't understand. No. And then I was like so caught up the whole time in understanding the psychology behind Frasier and the complexities of the relationships between these 3 men. And I spent a lot of time on that and on my own, like, you know, Jackie and I are English majors as background. So a lot of reflection on just the structure of this book and how it's not really that great as a novel. And I don't know, I just went around in circles in my own head quite a bit, and I did not find it a convincing display of utopia. Like, I didn't want to join Walden Two at the end of it. I do only want to do 4 hours of work a day, though.
Same.
So
okay, all right. Well, let's talk a little context of when the book was written, because I think, as we all brought up, while there are some interesting ideas here, the fact that it is such an old book, and even Skinner's Walden Two revisited piece at the beginning is such an old piece of writing now, there's a lot of additional context. So, Alan, I have some here. I know you've always got like your finger on the pulse. No matter the decade we're talking about, you always have a good sense of what's going on.
Yeah.
So please jump in anywhere. But some of the key pieces about when did Skinner write this? So at this time, he was a professor. He was about to start working at Indiana University, or University of Indiana, and he had 1 child who just finished her first year of school, and it was the end of World War II. He'd written a book, The Behavior of Organisms. That's it. And then when we think about it, I know I started reading this book thinking there's going to be so many behavior analytic ideas, and really, spoiler alert, the main like idea that you would say as a behavior analyst, aha, I see it, is use of positive reinforcement versus aversives. And there are some other smaller ones or ones
presented
that
in chapter 29 out of 33.
Yeah, the first time you will see the term positive reinforcement is at the end of the book, pretty much. So it's not a book in the sense of it's not an ABA primer in anything, because there was only so much research on human behavior and sort of with that behaviorist lens at the time. So he was at a dinner, and a lot of this is from the Times piece, some of it from his Revisited. He was at a dinner, he was talking with someone, World War II was ending and the soldiers are coming back. And he was talking with a lady about, what should they do when they get back? And this is from his Revisited, or the Times piece, I believe. What a shame, he said, that they would abandon their crusading spirit and come back only to fall into the old lockstep American life, getting a job, marrying, renting an apartment, making a down payment on a car, having a child or two. When asked what they should do instead, he answered, they should experiment. They should explore new ways of living, as people had done in the communities of the 19th century. So there's a lot of sort of Shakerism, which was a kind of a movement, or some of like the moving back to the land movements of the kind of the 1800s. If you come visit Massachusetts, we have lots of old kind of communities that had some like kind of Walden Two pieces to them. And from that idea, he said, I'm going to write a book. I got some time before my new job. And in 7 weeks, he wrote a book originally going to be called The Sun is But a Morning Star, which is the end of Henry David Thoreau's Walden. If you were expecting a sequel to see what happened to Henry David Thoreau, this is not that book. That doesn't come up. Thoreau is mentioned, but it's not the continuing adventures of Henry David Thoreau.
I heard that Thoreau's mom still did his laundry while he was living in the cabin in the woods.
I mean, that does not.
Because he's a man. He's a man.
I'm not surprised he doesn't have a washer and dryer, and he can't use
Walden Pond, even back then.
I mean, he doesn't want to do that.
Just saying.
He's too busy.
Wandering around?
Too busy.
And then
wandering
they pointed out in this book, too, that was just an experiment of one man, not a community.
Yes. So the book took a while to get published. It was published, it was written in 45.
A badly written book.
And it was published in 1948 and received mixed reviews.
Yeah,
the New York Times review said it was alluring in a sinister way, and appalling, too.
Do you feel bad for Skinner because all he wanted to do was be a writer and he's not really good at writing?
I don't feel bad for Skinner.
No, I think things all worked out for him in the end.
He's okay. You don't know until you try.
I mean, he's a bad writer, but he's like one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century.
But that's not what he wanted to be.
So he'd go home and he'd be like, after a standing ovation lecture at a conference, he'd just go home and just sit in his bed and just cry himself to sleep.
You don't know.
Perhaps my pigeons like my books.
He only did that to make a paycheck. He's like, I'm interested in this, but my heart's passion.
I'm the next Hemingway.
He never fulfilled his heart's passion.
Oh, we don't know that necessarily for sure.
I'm besties with him. I talked to him beyond the grave.
Oh, okay. Seance that?
Yeah. Just kidding.
So the book really was not like a huge seller. It did eventually, as of the 70s, so in the New York Times article, he had a graph of sales that he kept in his office, at least at the time, the author said.
See, that's sad.
And it did begin selling more and more. And as of when I started doing my notes for this episode, June 29th, 23rd, this is the number 21st book on in behaviorism psychology on Amazon, and it's the 95,896 books in all of Amazon's listings of books sold.
That's not bad.
Still in print.
So still in print.
Yeah.
I also spent about 30 minutes trying to figure out how do you find out how much a book is sold, and the answer is it's very hard, and it's
kind of like knowing how many podcast downloads.
They don't make it easy for you. That's for sure.
Well, I don't know at the time, but I did have an article that I pulled up that no one read this book until the 60s.
Yeah.
And then it was 79, he finally hit the 2 million mark. So no one was reading this at the time, except his fellow psychologists probably, to be like, stop writing, Skinner.
Oh, yeah.
So it had very little impact at the time. It was much later. I think that's why the Times piece was written in the 70s, because it was another time of change in history. So everyone finished World War II. And I mean, I understand why. If I came home from World War II and all of a sudden there's jobs and everyone can move to the suburb and I'm a white man, I probably would not want to change the way things were too much, because a lot of people were able to have stuff in a way they hadn't been able to have before. Not all people, certainly, but a lot of folks. Whereas I think at the end of the 60s, 70s, you were seeing a lot of the rejection of the mainstream culture. So something like a Walden Two would be more appealing to some people. And there have been some Walden Twos. And Alan, you mentioned Kuhlman's Living Walden Two book as sort of a follow-up of what those communities were like. The only two real communities that I saw like mentioned over and over again, there's one in Twin Oaks.
Not anymore, though.
It's gone now. And they actually visited Twin Oaks at the time of when the New York Times piece was written. They went and visited. And the big takeaway was these people are living in like poverty. They're living in this like very, very sort of, rundown area. And it didn't seem sustainable.
Yeah.
Whereas Comunidades Los Halcones, which stands is the Community of the Bifurcated Pillars, was founded in 1973 and is still around. Though I think Kuhlman mentioned there was a lot more religion sort of supporting some of the people who lived there. So not exactly what you get in Walden Two, where religion was not necessarily outlawed, but was not really expected to be something that a Walden Two community would care about for any length of time. However, part of the book is about experimenting and seeing what works. So at least for that community, having a religious background and religious faith is a component of their community. So, I think Skinner was really happy that people were starting to read his books, though he did mention in the New York Times piece that this is not meant to be what is the quote? It was a really good one. It's not meant to be a handbook for hippies, is not the purpose of Walden Two. But I think he does see Walden Two, and I think he mentions this in Walden Two Revisited. He does see a lot of the same ideas or some of the key components of Walden Two as being still relevant. And I kind of want to, I know we talked about some specifics in the book that felt wrongheaded or felt very of their time in a bad way. But when it comes to some of the components, like, are there pieces in Walden Two that we all might agree, like this probably should be something that we're thinking about in our communities more than others? Like for me, I loved the sections talking about politics and the idea that who runs for office, people who need to have answers, and they will make their answers come about based on power, and how we need more just experimentation and that spirit of what will work and how do we know it worked. And then we have to try it and then implement something and make effective change for our communities rather than just counting on any one person to be in charge. I think they talk a lot about how democracy is not so much about everyone gets a vote so much as everybody gets a vote, but they don't have any power. It's just nice that they get a vote because the people in power can then blame them for voting for all the things that have gone wrong when they really had no say in it. And I think in a lot of our political systems now, I find that idea we need not leaders, but we need communities that are interested in the benefit of the community as a whole. I think that is an important component of government that I see getting left out a lot. I mean, I don't follow politics as much as I used to because it is frustrating, but something like that, some of those themes I think still would be resonant. I would find them still to be useful. But some of the other pieces, I think we'll talk about how they're not ones that any of us would be happy about. And most people probably would agree.
It did feel, when you're reading the book, a little culty.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially when they're talking about women's dress and they're like, we're not quite trendy,
mm-hmm.
but we're not trendy. Right? And it's like, we use timeless things, but then we wear our hair a certain way. And they're like, well, what if somebody wants to come messy? Can they come say, oh, well, I should think not. Right? When he writes back,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
like, well, what if somebody wants to come to lunch and they haven't showered? Well,
These things just wouldn't happen.
They just
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't happen. Like,
right.
that part is weird for me. Because obviously it would happen. Right? I hate showering.
Not if they were properly behaviorally engineered.
Yes.
Because
But that's creepy, right?
Mm-hmm.
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the way he puts it. On the
Yeah.
other hand, if we took about it from the idea of like people who do that, some people just do it out of choice. But if people are needs are being met, how often is that going to happen? I think is the flip side.
Right.
He just is not a good writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Like, and similar with the dress, I think he's trying to sort of not engage in the modesty versus fashion debate.
Right. Yes.
And just by saying, oh, well, we have trends, we're not the trendiest, and I don't want to talk anymore about this.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
He didn't want to write the cool internet piece of like, what are the 10 pieces of clothing that never go out of style?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, they all
sweater vests, I think.
Sweaters, blouses.
I think when you get one of those jackets that have the leather arm pads, like a real professor, those are always in style, I believe.
That's funny. But yeah, and then when he also tried to bring up like when to have sex debate, right? Like very quickly, like
I thought this was a pretty sex positive book.
I mean,
oh yeah?
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm from Puritan New England.
Sure.
The fact that they put the word sex in it makes it a sex positive book as far as my education tells
me. It was, but it was in the context of saying we're going to have our teenagers get married and start families.
Mm-hmm.
No, not get married. They didn't have to get married. They just had to start having babies.
And you could have sex outside of wedlock, and it wasn't like you can't. It was like
there's no bastardy.
Yeah,
they said that.
Do you know why? Because nobody got married. So that was the thing, right?
They got married.
They got married, but they didn't have to at 16. So at 16, you have the kids. But of course, your tastes are going to change. And so you get married when you're an adult after having 5 kids by 22 years old, right? And then your whole world's open up because you actually don't have to take care of the kids, which also is creepy.
Yeah.
I do like the book, but there are creepy parts, right?
Yeah, I don't know. And it ties into the politics, too, is, they're saying, like, we don't have a democracy because we should just trust the people who designed the place, that everything's going to work out correctly because, we've removed all of these, basically the problematic elements of the human condition, right? Which we've done through behavioral engineering. So no one's going to feel jealousy or envy or anger anymore.
Ever. But on the flip side, when he asked, are you happy? That woman's like, I haven't thought if I was happy. Remember that part?
Right.
And she's like, I haven't had to think about my feelings, which also is problematic.
It's a huge suspension of disbelief to me that one could create a system in which none of these things exist anymore, and that even without democratization, we would have leadership that actually protects the goodwill and safety of its members, because every other situation in history, and I know they say don't listen to history, every other situation in history, powerful people become corrupt.
I think when we talk about some of the themes, I definitely hear in many of the critiques and the concerns that, very valid points, but some of it is, and I think it comes through a lot more in the Walden Two kind of revisited essay than in Walden Two itself, that we shouldn't be reading, no one should read Walden Two and say, aha, I'll do what they did here, and this will make an amazing community. It's more, I think, the themes. I think the themes are what spoke to me. The idea of why do we consume so much, at least in America? Why, and in a lot of places, like, why do we consume? Why is everything so important? And what happens if we just did more with less? And not in a leisure class has the most and everyone else should just deal with it. But like, what if we just...
It's about efficiency.
What if we were thinking about efficiency? What if we were thinking about... So when we talked about, say, like clothes, when we first started talking, that idea of, well, the trends don't change. I think, Alan, you were maybe getting at this a little bit, that idea of it's not about the fact that fashion doesn't exist or fashion doesn't change. It's just, what if everyone grew up being like, yep, I have clothes and I like these clothes and they're useful clothes, and that's as far as it went. And how do you engineer that? I don't know. I don't really love how it's in the book, but that idea sounds interesting to pursue. Like, what if we didn't have to just keep generating new clothes for every season because there's a financial motivation to get new trends out? Like, would we be happier overall? Would that be better for the environment?
On the flip side of that, I would say that, and I think this speaks to what sort of Jackie talked about, like it feeling culty, is like fashion and self-expression. We tie those things together. And so if someone doesn't want to like dress like everybody else, like, people now, even now, like people go through a huge part of their expendable income to like make things like cosplay and to like dress a certain way because they want to. Part of that is like a response to some of the more like oppressive and exclusionary parts of our culture. But mean, I think that is a basic human drive to want to like be comfortable in how you dress. Again, I think the problematic nature comes from he's assuming that if everyone's needs are met, you don't have to think about those things.
Mm-hmm.
And he just goes from there.
And that you won't care to.
Right,
Yeah.
because you won't need to.
Well, some of it too, and we can, we'll get into this more when we talk about like individual sections, but a lot of the, well, I guess we're at the part where we're talking about kind of the book as a book, right? As a written book. A lot of the sort of assumptions made when this book were written, it did have a sense of we want to have less work and we want the work to be meaningful. And then people have time for their own pursuits. And I feel like Skinner in Revisited, if you asked him something like, what about fashion? What about people whose passion was dress and clothing, would probably speak of, well, that would be just like any other leisure pursuit, or that would be like any other scientific or artistic pursuit. However, when the book was written, it does sort of feel like the only leisure activity Skinner could think of is like, well, what do people do for leisure and art? Well, they play instruments and they're in an orchestra, right? That's what everybody wants to use their free time for, or they paint, or they garden. Like, that's it. The three leisure activities.
Yeah. Gardening's not that hard, so you only get 1 credit of work for that.
Oh, because everyone loves gardening. You would have to give me all my work credits to get out in the garden for an hour.
There's so many people want to do that, so.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey everyone, sorry about the sudden transition we're about to have here. We had a little bit of a computer crash, audio switch. So while we were able to recover all the audio, so all the content is there, we did not, we sort of had like a 20 to 30 minute block in between. So, and we weren't sure if we'd get the audio back. So it got a little wonky. But in any case, we're going to continue our discussion of Walden Two. Just please don't think you missed anything when the next part of our conversation, we kind of might sound like we're just jumping into a slightly different topic. Again, sorry about that. But actually, before we get back into that audio, I almost forgot. I should give you your first secret code word. What better place to get the first secret code word? Because by listening to this, we are ACE and Quaba approved. You're able to get 2 learning credits. And if you're listening to this as a member of our Patreon subscription group, well, you're getting those 2 CEs for no additional charge. Just go to the Patreon page to get your special extra third discount code. But this is the first code for those CEs. It is Phoenix, 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 the mythical firebird that dies and comes back to life. It was in like Harry Potter and whatnot. It's also the name of a city out west, Phoenix. Okay, and then we're going to jump right back into the show, which is going to sound like it's already in progress. Again, sorry about that. All right, so we kind of talked about our initial thoughts on the book itself as a piece of fiction, as a piece of behavior analysis, some of our general feelings in reading it, our own changing context, history of it. Let's get into a little bit more about what happens in this book, and then what are some of the big pieces we've sort of hinted at, but we'll get into them in a little bit more of a deep dive. So in terms of plot, if you've never read a utopian novel, it basically follows the plot of group of people goes to special place. Group of people are amazed by special place. And the end.
Not all people are amazed, though. Some people leave.
I don't know. I've never read some of the old. I would imagine if you're like, ugh, Walden 2 was boring. I can't imagine reading any of like the original kind of books, like the books that quoted Utopia as being anything other than even more painful. Maybe not. I haven't read them, so I don't know.
What is a book that is a utopia?
It was Plato's Republic, which is the original proto, and this is more literary than that, in that it's not a Socratic dialogue, but it's still it's basically a dialogue. Yeah. You've just got a couple extra speakers. Mm-hmm. So
in college, my history professor organized our class by talking about, it wasn't just a history class, we also read novels that related to different time periods, but they were all dystopian fiction. Mm. I know. So at different points of time, we would read a dystopian novel and then relate it back to the time period. So I think I have only read dystopias and not utopias, which may have also colored my viewing of this book as well, because it doesn't sound dissimilar to the dystopias.
The problem with utopic fiction is that they're kind of nightmarish, because they're almost always one European ancestry white guy's view of how the world should be. Or is an allegory for how we should be rational and like overcome our like base needs. And that's basically all of utopian fiction. And it's kind of dystopian anyway. It's just, that's the thing about dystopian. It's like, well, this is horrible, so let's make it interesting to read.
And I think for modern readers, most books they're going to be familiar with will be either more dystopian type novels or books where the beginning of the book is, and then they get to a place, and this place is so amazing, and everything is so much better, and what a great place. And then someone discovers the terrible secret, and then murder ensues, and maybe there's an action piece, maybe it's a horror story, and so, but there's really something like, oh, we're eating the babies, and that's how we keep Walden 2 alive. That never happened, although I spent probably the first 2/3 of this book waiting for the chapter where there was like a big twist of like, actually Frasier has been like sucking the blood of all the people here, and that's how he stayed youthful for 1,000,000 years or something. And I knew it wasn't going to happen, but it had that vibe for the majority of the book. Like, something bad is going to happen, and then it never did. It never really did. It just sort of boiled down to a bunch of people go to a place, hang around for a couple days, and then some of them stay and some of them leave.
Yeah, there was very little plot lines. Like, let's walk around and describe what we see.
Yeah, so
I was like, and in that sense, he really is drawing on like Plato's Republic in terms of his far too much. Mm-hmm. That's what, but he tries to make it more conversational than a Socratic dialogue, and it's a slog.
No. So you've got, I don't see, I did not find it a slog. I expected it to be a real slog. I actually was surprisingly into the discussions, but let's talk. So basically what plot there is, like, cast of characters. We've got Burris, who is a professor one of his former students, Rogers, comes in. He's coming back from World War II. He just finished his service with his buddy Steve, and they come back and they say, I heard that there's this place, because I don't want to come back to the way life was after fighting in the Pacific. I want to do something else. And they said, didn't you used to have a friend or a colleague, Frasier? And apparently Frasier is this person who is, instead of becoming a respected professor, has gone on to found Walden Two.
It sounds like he was like annoying and mean, though.
And I don't think Skinner is trying to hide that Frasier is he's a real piece of work throughout the book. He is not the protagonist of in some ways he is. And I can't tell if it was a narrative device, if I can't make the character telling you how great Walden 2 is really great, because then no one will believe it, or whether the point was it doesn't matter who's in charge of Walden 2, because this guy's not even in charge of Walden 2 necessarily. It's the ideas that are important, not the individual people, which is one of the themes kind of later in the book about hero worship and leaders. So
it is very curious how dislikable he made Frasier, and I do not understand the rationale behind that.
I don't think he intentionally made Frasier unlikable.
Ugh.
I think that is my take would be that is the qualities that Skinner had and was often criticized for put into someone that he thought would be the protagonist, or at least a protagonistic character, and they're just not good qualities.
Mm-hmm.
But they're qualities that because again, he was... So again, I think just for the listeners, Professor Burris, literally B.F. Skinner's first name is Burris.
Yeah. It's spelled differently, I think.
It's spelled differently, but still.
Very unusual name.
Yeah. And then Fraser, I think, again, Frederick, you have B and F.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I didn't even think about that either.
Yeah.
Man, I thought it was like really coming to something as like Fraser's definitely Skinner. He's a part of Skinner, but then everyone else knew that, and I just feel sad.
And Skinner does say in that Times piece, he did say, I wrote this book as, quote, self-therapy. And yes, he means both of those characters to be parts of himself.
I'm just sad that
how he
I
thought
that
of and like, what he wants things to be, or ideas of what things could be. That is the purpose of those two characters.
Yeah. And I just have to say, for this, since we're talking about content, the other person that they sort of mention is this Professor Castle, who's like the old school academic, and it's not subtle to name your like old school academia character like the monolithic name. He's like the bastion,
tower.
The ivory tower, the bastion of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so we, from page one, we're in that level of subtlety and nuance. So
we've got Castle, the sort of the skeptic of the group. We've got Fraser, the person in charge of, well, he's not in charge of Walden Two, but he founded Walden Two. It was an old colleague of Burris. We got Burris, and then we've got Rogers and Steve, who are soldiers or former soldiers, and they bring their best gals. They bring Mary is Steve's gal, and Barbara, who is Rogers' gal, and they all go visit Walden Two.
But you'll be pleased to know, dear reader, that Mary and Barbara are both very attractive women.
They're really
attractive.
As are
all the women in Walden Two. Very attractive.
Because everyone is attractive in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they didn't really need to bring that up. It's written for the male gaze.
None of the men are ever described in their appearance or in level of attractiveness, but all of the women are.
I think Mary is the job of, she's a good partner to Steve and sort of does whatever he wants. And Barbara is the society woman who's, she seems kind of, she's not like outright manipulative, but like all of her scenes are sort of like, she's like the Castle character, but a woman, so she doesn't get to do as much.
They have very little personality.
They didn't do much. Barbara seemed like
they're pretty,
she was a bit of a flirt and negative.
They just left the conversation often, so we could be alone with the men.
Yeah.
Unless it was a scene with Burris in which he kind of hits on both of them at various times.
Yeah, like the breakfast scene where he's like, Mary, come have breakfast with me.
Yeah, he's a little pervy.
Am I attracted to Mary?
Am I very old and she's very young?
Yeah, but in any case, that plot doesn't mean anything. Those are just weird scenes that he throws in the book. I don't know if he was like, I should probably add something to this so it's a book and not just me telling you some cool ideas I had the other day.
Or it represents, I mean, again, because I don't like it, try to be creditable. He's writing about attitudes that he and his, like, that are just common. That like,
I wonder what his wife felt like reading all of his books about sex and being attracted to Mary. Maybe she's like,
I mean, it's pretty tame.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, he writes in Revisited.
It's a product of its time, right?
Yeah.
We can't deny that. And
and he writes, like I think what I was going to say, he writes in Revisited that he like feels bad for women being resigned to domesticity. So there is this like feminine mystique kind of approach to womanhood, even if that book's not written yet.
Yeah, I think he's thinking he's being progressive.
And he may have been being
because he's
progressive.
Like, let's separate women from these roles that they traditionally have to have.
Yeah.
So they can do gardening.
And there's like that swinging too far the other way idea of like, we're escaping the Victorian era, Victorian ideals. So I'm going to talk about like how attractive I find these women.
I guess.
I don't think it's right. I just think that could be where that's coming from.
Yeah. So they all get to Walden Two, and
Don't you want to say your part about?
Oh yes. So speaking of cast of characters, so Alan, you might have thought of this already. Someone else might have thought about this. I could not find any proof of this online, but I'm going to say it's 100% correct based on my limited amount of research. So when I'm looking at the characters, we talked about Burris. I started thinking of this because we have Burris, we have Frederick. Okay, that's BF from BF Skinner. We've got, I don't think the ladies' names necessarily mean anything, kind of common names. We've got Castle. I think that Alan, you brought up that metaphor. I'm like, what's up with Rogers and Steve? And I'm like, wait a minute. Rogers, Steve Rogers, Captain America.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that can't be. He can't have named the 2 World War II characters after Captain America, who is still a popular character to this day. And I thought, there's no way he would know that. But I look back and I was, well, Captain America first came out in 1941, and comics at the time were selling, I think I found some publisher stat that was like, they sold like 1 million copies of Captain America, something like that, a year. There was some big number. So this is all over. Marvel sold 1 million Captain Americas per month during World War II. Although this Publishers Weekly thing was from like the mid 40s, so World War II wasn't over yet. But so I take it with a grain of salt. So in that regard, I was like, so Skinner, who did serve in the military doing like military research, he may have come into contact, or is likely to come into contact with Captain America comic books. So I think he did name these characters after a Marvel character.
Well, and I mean, I would agree because of how anti-Nazi Skinner is. Like, and Jack Kirby was known to like go down to the street level when Nazis were organizing outside of Marvel and like say, let's punch some Nazis. So I think you're probably right. And I did pick up on that I was like, okay, that, and given his level of subtlety, yeah, these all-American boys are Steve and Roger, sure.
So unless somebody has a reason to know that is not right, I think, and whether, again, I'm sure people have had this idea, I could not find anyone writing about this on the internet, so I'm going to say right here first on ABA Inside Track, we're breaking the story, B.F. Skinner, Marvel fan. He's a big, he's sad he missed Endgame, he would have been sad, it would have been great. So, there we go. Fandom in the 40s. So we get all our characters. They go to Walden Two, which is a small kind of, nature community of about 1,000 people. And they just visit various places in it. They look at the landscaping a lot. They talk about how they herd their sheep. They talk about the different ways they build their houses. They eat a lot of meals in their cool, dining room area.
Speaking of the sheep, I love they spend literally 7 pages on describing how the sheep mow the lawn so that people do not have to use lawnmowers and how they move the sheep around.
They do that on Martha's Vineyard to kill poison ivy. They get goats. You can hire out goats.
It was 7 pages.
It's a bit long.
Gave me real Tess of the D'Urbervilles vibes.
Yeah. Look at these sheep, and then we'll use them later. Oh, and then they're like, oh, we know that the sheep love the mint. They're like, they only see each other at the dinner table.
Gross.
Yeah.
Yeah, they eat a lot of meals. They meet a few other characters. There's Mrs. Meyerson, also attractive, who is in charge of clothing.
Mr. Meyerson.
Does have a. I was expecting Dr. Meyerson to get mad and punch Burris. Dude, back off. Clearly, you're some outsider and you're kind of hitting on my wife. He doesn't really do anything though. He sort of shows up and he's like, "I'm a doctor, but nobody calls me doctor because we don't do honorifics here in Walden Two."
Man, I'd also be sad about that. You spend a lot of your time in school, boy.
Yeah.
Boy.
He meets an old lady, Mrs. Olson, who I actually kind of like Mrs. Olson's little scene with Burris, where they're just sitting and talking about it, and she really captures, I think, a lot of relays a lot of Burris's fears of she didn't know who Frasier was. She's like, I think I know that guy. He's always walking around. She brings up the fact that she hasn't been busy in so many years, even though she lists all these things she does.
She says that. She specifically says. Because he said, are you happy here? Mm-hmm. He stops her as she's contentedly rocking in the sun. And she said, are you happy here? And he goes, I haven't thought about that in years.
Well, I kind of took that from maybe a happiness trap perspective of we try too hard to be happy. What if we just did things that we enjoyed and that were meaningful? Would we have to think about being happy anymore? So I didn't read it quite as and now she has no emotions or feel. I read it very much as happiness maybe isn't always a good goal.
I tend to swing the other way. That I do think that I think we get a little bit of an idea that Skinner is well, if we're unbothered, we won't be emotional. Mm-hmm. Emotions are responses to stressors, and I'm just not sure about that. I think Skinner is unfortunately anti-emotion sometimes. Unless it's sexual attraction, in which he's all about expressing.
That's not an emotion, though. That's biology. according to Tim. And you certainly could be right. My read was more of a, like, I mean, because I'm reading it from the perspective of also having a copy of Happiness Trap next to my bed, which I'm trying to, not because it's bad. I just been trying to read this and then other things. So, but I've been kind of looking into that as well. And I was kind of keep coming in and out of ACT reading. So that was more in my mind. Again, Skinner wouldn't have known that, but I wouldn't be surprised if I think his meaning of it was more about the emotions. When everyone has everything, they don't have the feeling, versus I think what I'm going to choose to take from it, the idea of we shouldn't just be trying to feel a certain way, and it's bad if we don't feel like we'll feel whatever we're going to feel. Mm-hmm. And that feeling is just like any other feeling. It's important and not important at the same time. Is kind of my stance on that. But again, I can't imagine that was exactly what Skinner was thinking. So they learn about the labor hours, and they do their labor hours, which felt like I was reading a really boring summer camp novel where they go clean windows for a long time. Burris flirts with everybody.
That's not a major feature of the book.
No, I think the point was more to talk about, like, look at these two women. One's going to stay and one's not going to, and here's why. But it was just had like a real creepy vibe throughout. They visit a lot of places. They go to a lot of shows. They get to see Frasier doing a piano solo and talking about he's bad at piano, which is 100% a Skinner thing. Like, Skinner mentions that. I can't remember if it was in the Times piece or in the Behavior Analyst article, but he mentions that, like, he always wanted to play piano and was never that good at it. So that's like he wrote himself right into that scene of, I'm playing piano and everyone's going to watch me, but I'm not that good.
There's a lot of assumption that everyone has the same background with respect to their training and education in art and music, and that they are all going to value the same thing, which I think, if we were to be looking at this through a culturally responsive lens, is a limited perspective.
Yes. Then there are a couple scenes, most of it is just like, look at this. And Castle says, I don't like it. And Frasier says, but it's great. And then they debate for a while. And Burr is sort of this milquetoast in the middle. And then we get to a couple scenes near the end where Frasier he kind of came off as a weirdo. He really comes off as he's demagoguing a lot. I don't want to say a lot, but there was something that I couldn't quite tell whether it was my read on Frasier or whether it was Skinner's meaning for Frasier, that he doesn't want to be like the king of Walden Two. He really wants to create a better society. And the ways he's going about it are a little weird. The way he talks about it are very strange. I definitely get where Castle is coming from with a lot of his concerns about Walden Two. Yes. But there's this really scene that I don't know, I found it weirdly maybe not weirdly, but I found it affecting, was when Frasier and Burris are in Frasier's room, and Frasier's room's a mess. And I think it's kind of to point out, like, Frasier has started this whole amazing community, but he himself is kind of a disaster. Mm-hmm. And he just points out to Burris, like, you've never liked me. Like, you never liked me when we were in school. And he just like really opens up how pathetic he kind of is. It's just like a person who wants to do better. And then he sort of gets upset and he like throws this piece of clay. They're experimenting with the best kinds of clay, and he throws it into the fire, and he's so upset. And
very metaphorical.
He's like, I'm a disaster because I never got to grow up in a place like this. Mm-hmm. And that really, I don't know, that I thought that was like the best, like one of the better scenes in the book in terms
it had
of
some conflict,
something happening, and just seeing this character who I've been like, this guy is kind of weird, and I'm taking everything with a grain of salt, like something weird's going to happen, and then just have it be sort of, no, this guy is just weird, and he knows he's weird, and some of what he's doing is because he doesn't think anyone should maybe be exactly like him in the future, outside of the ideas he has. But like, there's a better way to grow, and there's a better way to be. He then kind of gets rid of it because he talks about his throne. He likes to watch Walden Two people from like way up on the hill, and then he does feel a little. It kind of goes back to some of the concerns I know Castle has, that this guy's just going to be the dictator of Walden 2 someday. But I did like that. And then the end of the scene where he just like looks at the tile he broke and he's like, I have to remember which one broke and how it was sharp. Like that, I liked that scene. I thought that was a really moving scene for me in a way. And then, it
was a good scene.
Yeah.
It did feel like the most dynamic scene in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I can see the stage version.
175 pages to get to that scene. It was
That's maybe why you liked it so much, because you're like, is something going to happen? Is something going to happen? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's important to also know Skinner's personal background for this, because if talking about this is supposed to be a therapeutic exercise for him, this is the scene that's therapeutic. Skinner's not from a privileged background in terms of what he eventually became.
Mm-hmm.
His parents were like really religious and seemed maybe kind of anti-intellectual. His brother died when they were both teenagers. Like, he's a scarred man. And I think that Frasier, and us talking about like Frasier not being a likable character, he has summed up Frasier as like, well, those parts of me that I don't like about myself are this way because I didn't get to have the benefit of like a wholesome background.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not a reason to build a utopia based on, to sort of be like, oh, this is what I would have benefited from growing up. But again, his parents were like starkly religious, and I think he didn't have what it means to be a lawyer in small town Pennsylvania back in the day. I don't think is quite what we associate it with today. So yeah, and he wasn't socially advantaged. I'll put that. Even if financially his family wasn't poor, he didn't have like connections. He didn't have like a vast social network, and so going through the education system, he would have been a bit of a pariah, especially if his attitude was the way that it was. So I think that is where Burris being, you said a milquetoast, I think that's the persona that he had to sort of build up to sort of succeed academically. And that's why Frasier is a stark contrast, because it's like all the parts of his personality that he's been told is bad and probably doesn't like about himself or hasn't been successful for him. But the part that he identifies with, because he puts him as the founder of the utopian society. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. So that scene happens. There's kind of one last debate between Castle and Frasier, which did anyone pick up the part where Castle is talking? They're talking about freedom. And this is sort of the section where they're like, anyway, positive reinforcement in big neon letters actually gets thrown out in this debate. And Castle they're talking about freedom and sort of like that beyond freedom and dignity, sort of part of Skinner's writings and science and beliefs. And there's this part where Castle says, what are we talking about with freedom? And he's like, I'm holding a matchbook. How would you know, like, the freedom to drop or hold this matchbook? And then, Frasier talking about like, well, you're going to do it based on, it has nothing to do with whether you're free or not. It's based on all the other kind of context. Right. And it felt very much like a
Black Scorpion.
I know. I was like, oh, it's a Black Scorpion moment. How weird.
Yeah.
Instead of Simpsons predicted it, maybe we should have like B.F. Skinner predicted it, listicles more on the internet.
Well, he wrote both of them, so.
Yeah, but he didn't hold the Black Scorpion. That wasn't his quote. Someone else said that. Actually, yeah.
Churchill. Churchill said it, but Skinner wrote about the...
It was before.
Okay.
Before this book that someone said that? I can't remember when they said. I know when verbal behavior is later on, but I can't remember when the conversation happened. It was when he was at Harvard, so that would have been later.
The book was not published until 30 years after that conversation.
Yes. Oh, okay. So it already happened. Okay, so he may have just been pulling from an event that happened in his life already. And then pretty much the debate ends and Castle decides, nope, things are better the way they are, and this is a crazy kind of fascistic place, and I don't want to be here. I do sort of like how Castle was not written as the meanest character. Like, it would have been so easy to be like, look at Frasier. What a handsome guy. He has such great ideas. And like Castle's like a sniveling, tweedy professor, and he has terrible ideas. Like, I think Castle didn't come off as a terrible person. I think Frasier was weirder than Castle. And I felt bad a little bit in how at the end of the book, when Castle's like, I'm out at Walden Two. This place is like, it was a fun tour, but I don't want to live here. And he's talking about, he's grading his papers. And he mentions to Burris, like, you know what? I think there's some good ideas here. I think the students are really coming around. When he has spent the entire book being like, God, these students, they're so stupid. Like, teaching is like, he just seems like very anti, like, the kids aren't learning anything. Like, why aren't things getting better because of my great teaching? And I almost feel like he's convinced himself, like, yep, things are great the way they are, and they're going to get better this way, which I found to be kind of effective in terms of reading the book and saying, yeah, things should be different. And I don't want to be Castle, or I don't want to be Rogers, who goes back to, he leaves Walden Two and lives, with Barbara in their bougie suburb. Steve and Mary stay. They decide to stay. They're very excited. And then they all leave except for Steve and Mary. And then Frasier, Burris leaves.
He comes back.
But then he comes back.
Wait, I really love that his quitting telegram.
Oh yeah.
Quitting telegram. And it's like it's like the today's version, like F you.
Yeah.
Take this job and shove it.
Yeah.
It's like what he's about to write.
Man,
And the lady's
that
like, I
made
can't
me
telegram.
laugh.
I can't telegram this language, sir.
I just loved that part because I was like, imagine me quitting and sending my boss a telegram.
It was, dear President so-and-so, you may take your stupid university, ... So you can know where the sentence is going. And the telegram lady is like, sir, I can't send that.
And then he walks back to
Right.
Walden Two.
He's going to go back. He's won over at the end.
Yeah.
And it does seem like the last line's going to be a Thoreau quote. There's there's more day to dawn. The sun is but a morning star, which I know it's not his language, but it's such a pretty phrase. But then there's another chapter where a twist ending. You've been reading the book he wrote while he was at Walden 2 the whole time. And they're going to publish this book to let everyone know how great Walden 2 is as part of their PR campaign. And that's the twist. That's the twist at the end.
Bam.
Bizarre twist.
And then because I love to do last lines, and I don't think this is a particularly great last line, I glanced fearfully up toward the throne, which is like the place on the hill where Fraser would like to sit and just enjoy Walden 2. There was no one there, but I saw the familiar features of Walden 2 stretched before me, just as I had recalled them again and again on my journey back, and I drew a deep breath of satisfaction. Fraser was not in his heaven. All was right with the world, which I guess gets at that idea of like, Fraser is happy because Walden 2 is succeeding, but he is not the god that you would be worried he would be at the end. You know, it's not like the end of 1984, which again had not been written at the time, where, you know, sort of smiling up at Big Brother. And so it's sort of trying to get that idea of like, this guy's just a guy. Like the community and the experimentation is what matters. But it just, I don't know, the phrasing made me feel the opposite. Like, ooh, this is like something weird.
Yeah, well, in 2 chapters before, we had Fraser in the Christ allegory positioning himself. And, you know, I think that Skinner is trying to anticipate the responses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And head off criticisms or conversations so that they're happening within the book rather than outside of the book. And he has a chance to respond to the upcoming criticism that he knows is going to be happening within the context of the story. But why not just make the guy more likable?
Yeah.
Right?
I think there's something to be said
Am I
for
not understanding?
if you make your character who's showing you around Walden 2 the best person in the book, I think it makes the whole thing feel
propaganda.
less. Yeah, it feels like propaganda.
Maybe not make him so horrible though. Make him kind of good, kind of bad. Like the only goodness we see is when he's like looking at that happy birthday when the girl is like getting in, right?
She's old enough to go eat in the cafeteria.
Right, and he's like, and then he looks so proud and there's a tear in his eye. That's the only time I saw him like be happy.
Mm-hmm.
But see, I think that from his point of view, he's writing about, he can't make, Burris is the milquetoast because Burris is not his true self.
Mm.
Yeah.
Fraser is who he is.
Bam!
And it, like, Fraser is unlikable because B.F. Skinner was not very likable. But he's like, he's putting himself into that role. And I mean, at least he says, I'm this way because I didn't have this background.
Mm.
Like I'll throw him that bone. Like if we lived in a society that cared about people, like all of my irascible traits might not be there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he does feel vulnerable in that part, which is as close to likable as I guess we're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And they make that point throughout, right? Which is the first generation of people coming into Walden 2 are not the final product of this community because they're coming in with all of the existing cultural biases and faults that are a product of the imperfect society in which they have been raised. But if we can, bring those folks in and teach them how to teach the next generation, then that generation is the one that will actually experience the utopia. But we cannot deny that the current society produces imperfect humans.
Right. Yeah.
which can all be changed with the power of behavioral engineering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Which obviously I don't think is true.
Yeah, I don't think that's
Right. No, but then again, yeah, I think that just goes back to Frasier. Frasier can't be likable because I don't think Skinner knew how to write that character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's a brilliant in ideas, not necessarily going to be able. You can't do it all sometimes.
Right. Well, and then I guess it does also speak to the idea of don't follow me, follow my ideas.
Mm-hmm.
That might be another reason that Frasier is not presented as a likable person. It's like, my ideas are what matter. I'm a prick, but my ideas are good.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's a successful mechanism.
Right. That I can see the logic in that.
Yeah.
Though.
Yeah. And talking about, like, because I think in that debate section, Castle says that he's like mechanistic and Machiavellian. Mm-hmm. And I kind of just have to, I definitely agree with that. And they even ask, like, is Frasier a fascist? And he's like, I don't know. I'm a philosopher. I'm like, Skinner, that's not a great question to leave unanswered about your utopian society.
I mean, and not everyone gets in. Right? That is an implication.
Yeah, because you have to do all the questions, right?
You have to do the questions. You have to pass the physical.
If you are a criminal, you cannot come to Walden Two, because it's it's not an exact quote, but because society made the criminal, society can deal with the criminal. It's the paraphrase of the quote.
So there's already an expectation that quote unquote imperfect specimens do not get in.
They would let in teenage boys who tell sex jokes, though. They have a whole section about how it would be very effective for an adolescent like that to come to Walden Two, because they make a bunch of sex jokes. The kids, having grown up with this idea that they'll be able to have sex and it's not that big a deal, and all their education will provide no attention for the joke, and the behavior will go away because there's no reinforcement for telling sex jokes anymore in Walden Two.
Yeah, but sexual deviancy and misogyny are not the same thing.
No, exactly. And that's the one example they have of someone they would take out that might be considered. They won't take any undesirable. That would be someone who's like, well, that not exactly that, but they don't get too deep into. They only mention race once, I think, in the whole book when they're talking about field trips with the students. Mm-hmm. If they want to show them, like, this is what society's like, you could come here, but if you see all the excess and cool stuff, you have to also see how so much of production takes advantage of other people. So if you're going to see rich people, you got to see the poor people, and they get to talk to a black laundress, and that's the only reference to race throughout the entire book.
Right, which also then makes you think that Walden is also very white.
Mm-hmm. I would assume it's super white at Walden Two. I don't know if that was just because at the time, like, well, who would come here? Well, the white people I know. Hi, I'm B.F. Skinner. That's most of the people I'm with.
If you're going to vet your community with these level of standard, and society has discriminated against people where they can't meet that standard, then you are part of that. You are just repeating the mistakes of that society that you are trying to break away from.
Mm-hmm. And I would definitely be concerned about that too. I think it's hard to tell from the book. They don't go deep into all the questions they asked Steve and Mary when they came in. They don't really get into it a lot. So it is possible that it would have been super progressive. I don't Walden Two could be super progressive in that regard of really taking into account a lot of context that comes into the history that comes from being in a minority or less protected class, but they don't get into it, and it doesn't come up very much in the book. So it's very concerning, and I think it definitely probably was not thought of quite to the extent that we are thinking about it now when written. Maybe it was, but I mean, without it,
desegregation of the military was a hot topic during World War II, and Skinner would have known that. And so to not address it is craven, cowardly, in my opinion. Or just reflects his eugenics, whether it's intentional eugenics or unintentional product of his time, it's still, he didn't actively address that.
Yeah.
When he tried to actively address other things, after 22, men and women are considered equal with their jobs. He says that in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
After Onif had, 4 or 5 babies starting at age 14.
No big.
Where did the land come from?
They bought it.
They bought the land.
It's in Canton, by the way. There was one moment where they're like, we had to go out of the city to Canton, Massachusetts. And it's only it's like one place. And I was like, oh, I wonder where that was. Yeah, they bought the land.
Yep.
It's where IKEA is now.
Yeah. There was 4 or 5 crumbling farms.
Okay. I'm sorry.
That was in chapter 2. The 4 or 5 crumbling farms that they purchased the land from the farmers and kept some of the buildings, but then tore down some of the buildings.
Okay, now
right?
I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so Fraser just had enough money to start.
Well, they said
It was a group. The group got together and pooled resources.
And they said they were quite poor at the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think a lot of it comes in, they're whether you want to consider it, or whether one would consider it like predatory, they're sort of looking, when they buy land in the future, they're sort of looking at what land is cheap and available. Yes. How can they sort of become members of town? They talk about politics. They all vote along the Walden tickets with like a political bloc. So a lot of the policies they're looking forward to are going to be ones that benefit their ability to continue buying land so that they continue having Waldens. And there were a couple, there were, I think 6, so they're about to get ready for their 6th Walden. 2, one of them was unrelated to them. It was just someone who liked the idea and made their own in California, but the rest of them were all sort of within a couple hundred miles of each other.
And Castle pushes him a lot on this topic about if you're saying that you don't want power and yet you're having everyone vote in the same way, then why not just start to take over the politics of the town? And Fraser's like, well, yeah, maybe we will someday. Which
it doesn't go beyond like, well, it's for the greater good kind of an argument. So that is not as strong as I think some of the other arguments that he makes against Castle. He's able to sort of effectively debate. That one definitely has that vibe of like, I don't know what the future is going to hold. We'll probably have to do something with politics at some point. What will it be? I don't know. Let's not talk about it anymore.
Yeah. Maybe we'll take over the United States. And
they also then say they're not interested in taking over the United. They're not interested in making a federal government.
But he's not interested.
Yeah, he's not.
I think he is interested.
I get the sense it's more I want to be left alone, and that is actually that brings.
I disagree, Rob.
You disagree?
I disagree. He wants this to spread democratically. He wants there to be other Waldens. He wants this to become the force majeure because it is the best idea, and then not just America, but the world will become this way.
Somebody's in charge. That's
but I don't think it's it's less corrupts. I get that he wants to spread it, but less about he's not interested in doing it through like political action. Like political action is, at least that's purported. He's not interested in politics. Politics is not important. Politics is not effective.
I do not see Fraser as altruistic.
No. And I would say that you're right, only in that he's not interested in getting elected to any office on this. But again, Skinner seems to be drawing from some very antiquated anarcho-communist ideas about like, well, if we all just adopt this lifestyle,
right?
We we become the majority. Like it becomes our country, and I'm not saying it's like a great adoption of that, but I and there is a sense. I mean, he literally has a throne that oversees Walden. He doesn't want to be Hitler about it, but he also would be quite happy if everyone adopted this and he was the father of a new utopia.
I don't know if he cares so much about I think he wants there to be utopias. I don't think the Fraser character is written, at least as on the page, to my analysis, wasn't written as wanting to get credit for it. They spent a whole lot of time talking about the failure of the hero worship and how they don't want hero worship, and how, and it goes into some of their perspectives on history. And really this idea of, I don't need people to know who I am. And there's even that section where they're talking with Fraser's trying to get like an interview, or he's trying to chat with the Walden's 5 or 6 planners, and they're way too busy for him, and they sort of just keep blowing him off over and over and over again, and he can't even get them in. And so I'm assuming that section was written by Skinner to make it clear, like, listen, this guy, I know you think he's in charge, I know you think he's the weird boss, but he can't even get an appointment with these other people because they're too busy, and he's irrelevant to their conversation right now. So they're not going to stop everything to give him the time just because he made Walden Two. He's the founder of Walden Two. Now, whether we believe that to then be the case in real life, whether we believe that was everything Skinner meant. I can't say, but I feel it was written as to be like, Frasier doesn't want to be in charge, and look, he can't even be in charge. People don't even want to talk to him half the time.
Yeah. Don't think he's successful in executing that.
No,
that's fine. I think that's definitely
artificial. And so Rob had said, I was like, "What's up with this Frasier guy?" And Rob had said, "Oh, there's a twist at the end." So I kept expecting like a big
I thought it was
twist.
So when you read that, I was like, did I forget something? And then I was like, maybe he died and I didn't realize it when they talk about the
he was a
Frasers
ghost
in heaven.
the whole time.
But then I went back and looked because I was like, I don't remember a twist.
Right. Well, and then that passage, I was like, okay, he's not actually the architect of this place. He just thinks that he is, and like the structure of the place has like created or has been created such that it allows him to have this delusion. Like that was the direction I was going in, but there was not that big of a twist.
No.
At the end,
no.
At all.
It was that you were reading the guy's book versus book whole time. That was the twist.
Yeah, I didn't
even catch that was the twist.
Me neither.
Oh yeah, it's a very subtle twist.
I didn't get it either.
Yeah.
No, I was like, wow, did I really miss this book? Like, I've been reading it a lot of times, and did somebody really die?
No, I thought you meant that the twist was that Frasier has low self-esteem.
That's just part of the character. The twist was they were in a virtual reality simulacrum the whole time. There never was a Walden Two, man.
I like that.
So this book is unlike a lot of books we do for book club where it's like, let's talk about the first part and then the second part. Like you said, Jackie, if we did that, it would be super boring because the ideas, some of the ideas are like, here, this chapter is about the sheep. This chapter is about the managers at the dairy farm. But a lot of the chapters are, let's talk a little bit about politics, but not too much. Wait till later. We're going to talk about it in another chapter. So it sort of weaves some of the key ideas. A lot of the stuff on child rearing, they sort of hint at it for a while until, bam, like 3 or 4 chapters all about child rearing. So rather than like, let's start at chapter 1 and go through, I think let's just kind of go around the horn. Themes and things that happened in Walden 2 and sort of principles that you liked, didn't like, whatever, but you took note of as something that I want to talk about. I don't know, what the politics, education, their ideas on history. So who'd like to start us off with their Walden 2 thematic hot take beyond the ones we've already had?
I will just say the chapter on raising children. I don't want someone else raising my child.
Mm-hmm.
I never want someone else raising my child. I like the idea of community rearing, but I still want to be the primary child. Like I want to have a relationship with my child, and they said that it's inherent that you can't have a relationship with your child more so than everyone else because everyone views your child as their child. I don't love that idea.
Okay.
I think the reason I have kids is to build relationships with them and to have my own bestie, right? Even if it only happens for a few moments.
Okay, so
right?
Can you describe real quick, Jay, sort of like the general child rearing?
So the general child
section
rearing
of the book
was, you're 14, you want to do it, you do it, you have a child, and then you give it to the nursery, basically, and the nursery raises all of the children together, so they don't even eat with their family. Children eat alone with children. They have their own schedule. And they have shifts where people take care of them, but not their family.
No, you can take a shift in the nursery.
But you cannot have preference. So they did specifically say you couldn't like your child over other children because technically all of the children are your children.
But you could check your child out of the nursery because there's a scene where they see the family and they're having a picnic and they're playing with their baby.
Yeah, that's true, but that's still...
But then they say you're not supposed to do that. If you do that, you're supposed to take other children also.
With
probably,
you.
They probably don't do that for the babies because the idea of like, here's a bunch of babies, take them all on a picnic.
But yeah, so then...
Baby picnic.
So the children are children and they go to school and they also do chores until
they live 7. In the nursery.
They live in the nursery. They don't live with their family. And then
they live in like those little Skinner.
They got little Skinner cribs.
Yeah, little Skinner air cribs, obviously. And then at age 7, they technically become adults-ish and get to then enter the world of adulthood, which seems fairly young. But I guess if you're having, kids at 15, I mean, you got to get in there.
You didn't love the generalization of foods and restaurant types that they had in their cafeteria of how the kids got to try all the different.
No.
Restaurant styles.
What I really didn't love is that, number one red flag, when anyone's taking care of mass children, creepy, right? Because there are no systems in check then. If one group is taking care of all the children, I'm like, okay, that's a big, huge place for abuse, neglect, like some
they didn't get
sexual
into
stuff
that.
happening, predatory happening.
The training.
But none of those things happen.
They talk
here.
generally about training
But
for a lot of jobs,
know, right?
but how do you
I
train
know, I
someone
agree.
to be a child caregiver
Right.
to that many people?
Right. So that part I hate.
Mhm.
I would leave right away. What's that?
I don't know.
Doesn't sound like a car.
No,
But I would have left right away, right there. If someone's like, let me take your child from you, I'd been like, no, don't love that part.
Okay.
So that's what I want to say there.
I similarly disliked that section. I didn't like that idea of child rearing. How? Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, I think that again betrays Skinner's feelings about his own childhood, about having a very nuclear family with very religiously zealous parents who were not like participating in social life. And then I can see why he thinks this. It's awful, but the idea is that all these children would be on socially equal terms because who their parents are don't matter.
Mhm.
Right.
It's a horrible execution, but I think that would be his idea if I were being if I were being creditable rather than just completely undermining him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think that there is a lot of value in the idea of a community contributing to the raising of children. Because right now in America, the way we have it set up is families are really often very siloed and alone in their attempts to raise their kids.
Yes.
And it's hugely
Yes.
stressful.
You're on your own till there's a problem,
financially
and then it's your fault there was a
draining.
problem.
Yes, and emotionally isolating. And I think that it takes a village idea. There's a lot of merit to it because you just can't do this on your own. It's really hard.
Yes, I agree.
So in that respect, a lot of communal living ideas use that same concept of like where everyone is contributing toward the raising of the children. But this one takes it to kind of an extreme where you are not supposed to show favor towards your own biological children over other children. And, genetically speaking, we have a propensity toward protecting our genes through future generations.
Mhm.
I don't think you're going to undo that with operant conditioning.
And this section definitely felt, unlike some of the sections in the book where it did seem like, well, this idea only works if we train everyone to be in a Walden Two because you're talking about way too many environmental factors to control for where reinforcement is going to be delivered. This felt like a section of, no, we could probably do something like this without living in a Walden Two environment. What if we just decided to put more funding into parent education and public schools? So you probably could get a lot of these same benefits without being like nuclear family out, communal living in.
Yeah. So this part, I was like, no, the whole chapter. Every time I've read it.
But when you're a swinging bachelor like Burris, who cares?
Actually, when I was 20, the first time I read this, I think when I was 18 or 20, did not have children, did not plan on having children. I was like, that seems nice. And you can still as a 20-year-old, I'm like, somebody else will take care of my kids. I can go see them. It's like very Victorian. Like I'll see them 2 hours a day, but I can still do my own things. That seems really nice.
Yeah.
But then as I'm like, no, red flag. So that's, I think, one thing that's changed from when I read it the first time to now.
Okay.
There's something to be said for like when you have a baby and you're at the hospital and they say, would you like the baby to stay in the nursery like the first couple nights? And you say yes, because it is a lot of work and you're going to get to do it all by yourself. Don't worry. You got plenty of your own sleepless nights. But what if you do that every day? Like, no. That's not. Like, a break every now and again is one thing. But, and that's your kids. You don't have to see them anymore if you don't want to. I don't like that. Yeah, I agree, Jackie, that part. They felt like there were better ways to accomplish that.
Especially if you're only working 4 hours a day. I mean, you got a lot of time to hang out with your
But
kids.
I got to write a symphony and then perform it 30 times.
So, that's mine.
Yeah. What about some other sections and kind of general Walden Two components that spoke to y'all, either as positives or negatives?
I would like to talk about the work credits.
Okay. Tell us about the work credits, Diana.
So the idea here is that because everyone is living together, so they describe a lot this area called the ladder But I think it's just a connection between two different buildings.
Yeah, that
right?
has little like alcoves that you
All of
can
their
so
all of their
there's,
buildings
like-
are connected.
Sorry, I guess maybe I want to talk about the structure of Walden Two instead. So like there's like dormitory kind of places where everybody sleeps, and then there's cafeteria, and then there's like gathering areas, and then there's this place called the Ladder, which I think is just like a series of landings.
Yeah, I took
Right?
it to be kind of vertical. Like if you're doing your Wes Anderson version of
think
Walden 2, you've got your diorama. It's like seemed like it was like a...
I think it's like built on a hill.
Yeah,
There's like 15
I saw it,
different rooms, and they're each, you go up like 5 steps to get to the next landing type of thing. It's actually not important. What was my actual point?
You wanted to talk
Work
about
credits.
work credits.
Yeah, I want to talk about work credits. Okay, so they are, consolidating everyone together to have all of their meals together. Everyone's living in this kind of place together. And in doing so, you cut down on excess energy waste because everyone was doing the same things over and over again for like a small like nuclear family unit. So now that can be expanded to take care of everyone at once, and in doing so you actually create a much more efficient system. So they are able to reduce the amount of redundant labor in those ways, and in doing so freed up a lot of everyone's time. But there are still responsibilities to be had because they're somehow making money. They're selling goat soap or something. I don't know exactly what they are producing that's sustaining this 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Does anyone else know?
They do have some excess with farming at that point. Not a lot, though. A lot of it, I think, has to do with they don't need as much money because there's a level of self-sufficiency that they're able to produce. I forget the exact phrasing, but it's the sense of we're not well off or wealthy, but we have what we need.
I think they're
But
growing
they say,
they're growing most of their food.
Yep.
So that part is they're using from their sheep and their goats to make clothing, so they don't need that. They own their own land.
And everything's got this min-max quality to it of like, well, if only one person is in charge of our dental work and in charge of our sort of medical practice, well, we'll just say what the best way to do preventative care. So they talk a little bit about preventative medical care too. So I think a lot of the expenses that we think of, well, I have this expense, this could happen to me. There's this sort of, well, if you mix these things all together and think of everything preventatively, you don't have any of the problems anymore. You don't need to spend any money or time dealing with those problems anymore. They're looking at fluoride in the nursery.
Yeah.
Which was one thing I was like, wait, when did fluoride become like a thing that we're just like, fluoride, isn't that in all the water? It was Michigan 1945. So that would have been like new. Like fluoride in the water was going to be like a new thing.
A very at the moment idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've divided it up so that everything's more efficient. And in doing so, not everyone has to work as much as they used to. So they kind of calculated it out and said it looks like about 4 hours of work is what everyone would need to do in order to sustain the lifestyle that we have.
Oh, an average of 4, because some people may work more, some people may more.
Right, and then different tasks
per year
are weighted differently. So they make certain tasks more appealing by giving them more credit hours per hour. So something like cleaning the bathrooms would be worth a 1.5 for every hour. So if you took on that job in only 2 short hours, you would get 3 hours of work credit. And then other things that are not as, strenuous just count at a 1.0. I don't think they ever go below 1.0 though, right?
Yeah, there were some that
there were some?
I think like gardening
Gardening is 1.0.
Oh, talking to people from outside wasn't worth very much. And you had to do some amount of your work credits in physical labor. Like you couldn't just be doing all the thinking kind of jobs.
Right, but they made those more appealing by weighting them more heavily, and everyone should be doing, for the preventative piece, everyone should be doing some type of physical exertion anyway.
They say pleasanter jobs have lower values.
Yes.
So 0.7 or 0.8. So 5 hours a day or more.
Oh, you did find that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Working in the flower garden has a very low value, 0.1.
Oh, 0.1. I had 1.
Your Walden Two's falling apart already, Jackie. Everyone's just gardening all day. Looks beautiful, though.
Yes, and so the idea is that everyone's doing different types of work. But of course, you still do need people who are specialized in some things, such as, I don't know, running an organization or being a dentist or being a doctor. So they do send people out to get that type of training with the then hopes that they come back and do it. And they say we have tons of people who are doctors. So even the doctors, even though they can only they can do their specialized job, they still only have to work a certain number of hours because we just have so many.
Yeah, and their goal was for no one person to be like, I'm the specialized X, Y, or Z. They didn't want people to have specialized positions in that regard, though they understood the need for individualized training. The goal was not, well, you're the doctor, you only do the doctor
Right. So
work.
the doctor might also do the windows.
Yeah. They have a lot of windows to clean in this place.
Apparently they do.
And I have to interrupt here because this is pure like anarcho-communism. Like he is borrowing this straight out of like Soviet idealism, like Trotskyite ideas of we shouldn't. Because even now, like popular versions of that of like, yeah, like we should all have two jobs where you have to go work in the field, not enough to like pick all your own food, but because it's something none of us want to do, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
So, but also I like that idea that there's no technocrats, no like we aren't beholden in a capitalistic sense to like one person can't monopolize services. Like no, my services are worth like 5 points per hour,
right?
And I only have to work 1 hour a day, or 1 hour every other day. And if people are sick, well, that's not my problem.
Yeah. And then they do acknowledge that some people are like their responsibilities are planning the place. You know, like they have to have people who know how to do.
Right. And those people,
the manager. Well, they're the planners, and then they're the managers.
Or the planners.
There's two.
They're not elected.
Yeah, that's weird.
So the people who live there don't vote on who's going to.
The planners are chosen from a pool brought together by the managers. They pick
Which
two
also seems creepy.
people,
Seems like a popularity contest.
and then you become a planner. And a planner is a term limited job.
Still seems popular.
I think managers were not term limited. I think you're a manager as long as you're a good
Supreme
manager,
Court.
As long as like everything's effective in your zones.
Right. So if it's just old white men on your management, they're going to elect the people. They're going to choose who are the planners.
Well, but from the beginning, there were 3 men and 3 women were the original 6 planners.
I apologize.
Yeah. But still.
And it does, and you do get the sense that you probably could have, over time in Walden Two, said, we need more diverse people in Walden Two, and you could go to the planners and say, we want to mandate more, diversity in the group, and they would debate it and talk about it as a rule. And again, if they're all a bunch of white old men, they might decide, it's not that good a rule. We don't want to do anything.
It's hinging on the assumption that everyone is going to behave magnanimously and for the good of the group, which I see no reason to think that is how things would actually shake out.
But they've all been raised communally.
I know, Alan.
And they all have the things that they need to have. And I think that gets challenging because a lot of the problems, like when you think about so many problems that we have societally, they do stem from fear of losing, fear of not having more, fear of having people take what I have.
It's a capitalistic system.
And if all of that were gone, would that... It would significantly change our behavior. Would it change it to be the Walden Two utopia? I don't know, but it would change how we behave to each other. It would change how we view other people having get. And they spend a lot of time talking about that. Like, what if when you lost your job because you weren't good at your job, that's not a big deal. This wasn't the job for you, but there's a million jobs and you're going to get a job that you are able to do and you enjoy doing, plus a bunch of other jobs. Like, it's not like I'm the dentist. It's all I do. I'm also the window washer and the farmer and the greeter. And then I'm the dentist at these periods of the day. Would it be the same as sort of the fear we have? I tried to read the book that way of like, this makes me feel weird, but does it make me feel weird because it is a bad idea? Or does it make me feel weird because it is not how my environment has been? It has not been where I've had all my reinforcers. Therefore, of course, it's a scary thought. And that was my challenge with the book of like, when is this a bad idea versus when is this just something I don't want to do?
Sorry, if you want to make your point first, Diana, please do. It reminds me of a couple things because...
I don't remember my point, so go ahead.
I'm sorry. One, it's really this idea of planners and managers. I think there has to be some sense that the managers are chosen somehow, and it will have to be some democratic process.
Even if it's behind closed doors.
Right. Well, and if you're over 22 and, there are those kinds of things. But again, that's the idea of the workers' council, is that like there are 10 people, 10 workers. From that group of 10, one of them is appointed like a manager, and then there's a board of managers who pick like a planner. That is pure, very simplistic, very badly adapted communism. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that what's interesting is that you see in 1984 and other books, but 1984, that the problem with like raising your children communally and divorced from their parents is then the state can then appropriate these children to turn against everybody, because their loyalty is not to like each other and family, it's to the state. So we do get a contemporary look at what the problem of this kind of idea is and how it can be corrupted. So
it's similar to that kind of Orwellian idea, Alan. I know when the group's talking about labor credits and how they can change the values of the credits based on sort of what people want to do, what they're not as interested in doing, Castle accuses Fraser of, isn't this a form of propagandizing? Like, this is the job that's important. And it did remind me of sort of the horse in Animal Farm that works itself to death because it's for, I'm doing this for the farm. And they just take advantage of his goodwill.
2 legs bad, 4 legs good.
Exactly. However, then Fraser sort of sees it more as that where's the reinforcement? It doesn't call it positive reinforcement, but of the sense of, well, if you take the jobs that are no good, you're done with your work a lot faster than someone who takes all the easy jobs. So now you have more time to pursue the things that are of value to you. So that being a little bit different, they were just asking people to do jobs because, well, don't you want to help out Walden Two? Like there's something in it for you beyond just this is for the good of the community. Though you do have people then saying this is for the good of the community. That's why it's worth more labor.
But I mean, the whole idea of credit exists is that you have to pay for your existence. Mm-hmm. That is an explicit part, that everyone has to earn 1,200 credits or something like that.
Yeah, annually 1,200. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
I don't know. Some of these ideas, I'm not as well read on say some of the more communist and socialist movements, but some of them, as uncomfortable as they do make me feel a little bit, it doesn't always feel that different than a lot of the ways, our Western society works now in terms of like, well, you're always working for something. So even some of the ideas of Walden Two I don't totally agree on. I do feel it's less about, I disagree with this, it's a terrible way to do things, so much as, well, that's not the way I do things, but critically, is the way I do things the best way to do things? And maybe yes, maybe no, but at least thinking about, is this the most efficient way? Does this benefit the maximum number of people, or does it just benefit me? Am I just looking out for myself or my family? And, again, I did try to read this with a mindset of, I'm not going to assume that the way I've done things is the best way to do things, which that spirit of experimentation that I think in Walden Two Revisited was kind of the key point that I think Skinner was like, if anyone remembers anything from the book, it's not do what's in the book. It's think of solutions to problems and experiment and try and try to do new things.
Yeah, I just want to say that both Skinner and Fraser, neither one of them are very good. Like, they're not political scientists, and they have this is a very oversimplified system that would not work.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't doubt that piece. I more just, there are a lot of things that we do now that I increasingly ask, why do we do that? Well, that's just the way we've done it. And isn't that the best for, and I don't know if I agree with some of that in the same way. So that was just the context I read the book in. Alan, what about you? What was one of the kind of the manager sections or the general kind of structures of Walden Two that you found most fascinating to talk about for good or because you disagreed so strongly with it?
Well, we've talked about this a couple times, but the sense of like human sexuality is very problematic in this book, both in terms of how the men talk to the women and the fact that like women, the women are afforded in theory an equal role, but none of them, other than the old woman, Miss Olsen, talks about anything, and she's not presented as like a big ideas person.
She's
So
a
that's
baker.
that's all very problematic. But then thinking just about historically, because we've talked about how gross it is, their ideas of like the age at which people start having sex and all of that. I looked into and looked a little more, what was the conversation happening at this time? And yes, like in the Victorian era, the age of marriage was 12. In the 20s and early 30s, you start to get the idea of like a 16 age of consent. But then in the 30s and 40s, it starts to weaken. And like terms like jailbait and things like that pop up. And the idea that like teenage, adolescent women, girls are sexualized inappropriately. This is in full swing when this book is written. So I'm just not sure where Skinner's coming from with the ages he's chosen. I mean, it's really interesting and very gross. I think it serves his mechanism accidentally of like communal child rearing, of just like, well, of course, like we're not going to have these young people raise these children. Like they're not.
They're
like,
too young.
They're too young. But then also like, well, they're not old enough to like rear them and be like involved in like civil life. Then maybe we want to teach birth control. But and I think this again goes back to him sort of rejecting at least some of Malthus, which he explicitly mentions. Like birth control is it Christian eugenics and birth control and all that are very part and parcel. And I think he is again rejecting what he had from his childhood. It's just horribly problematic.
Weird observation, Alan.
Yeah.
So just because I think about, like the writer Nabokov in 50s, right? Lolita, but he just like Lolita is like not meant to be this is like a great novel. It's like he's supposed to, like, he is a horrible person who is sexualizing a child, and he is a deplorable character. And Nabokov knew that. And the fact that there are people that read that unironically still is horrible. But I think about Nabokov writing about the sexual ethos of the 30s and 40s. So, it really speaks to the really problematic cultural conversation about sexuality that's happening at the time.
Yeah, it was surprise. I don't know. I found it surprising to read that. I guess I will also say having a baby at 35 was not great for my body.
Same. I had mine at 36.
Yeah. So they call that a geriatric pregnancy.
For a reason.
And it is truly difficult on one's body. But I don't think that means that people are ready when they're 15 to take on
Hell no.
that. And it's, the idea here is, again, it's like, oh, well, this is just something that happens and it's part of the community. And
it's a way to trap people into the community, to be honest, right? Because if your kid's here and...
Well, I don't think that he's thinking of it that way, but I think that
it could be.
He's like totally removing any of the emotion that's part of having a child. Like he's not thinking about that in the slightest, it seems. He's like, this is something your body needs to do, so why don't you go ahead and like get it over with early, and then you have your whole life.
You gotta get your homework done on Friday so you can enjoy the whole weekend.
Yeah. It feels like that. And that's just not what the experience is of having a baby.
No.
It is just as emotionally wrenching as it is physically wrenching. And he has no acknowledgement of that.
And I think that goes back to biologically, these people are able to have kids. And so I'm not going to examine or have like ideas about this. I don't think this is a saving grace, but at least there's no hint of like the older men preying on.
Not in this generation.
Not in this generation.
Give Walden two generations, and those old men will be marrying the 14-year-olds.
Right. But my question would be, if everyone's an adult, if you're not an adult, like if you're not equal, like as part of civil life until you're 22, Like there would be a fundamental violation of that. So it's kind of this weird attribution of like, well, sexuality is an adolescent thing, and and emotions are an adolescent thing, and once you're mature enough, you can leave those things behind, which is horrible.
It does. It does. I didn't even really think about that. But yeah, does Skinner sort of categorize, or at least in the context of the book, categorize sexuality as one of those things like drugs and alcohol that, like, I mean, you can do it whenever you want to, but realistically, once you're done with the biological need and you have all your other like normal, like your typical physical needs met, you're going to be so busy writing symphonies and practicing piano that you're just not going to bother with any of that stuff anymore. Like, who cares? You don't need to. Which maybe for drugs and alcohol is the positive, but yeah, I mean, is sexuality being thrown into that same category as like a necessary, well, not even a necessary evil, but it's like it's one more thing you could do, but why bother? Why would you, other than biologically? I
feel like in other contexts, Skinner seems to have such a clear understanding of why people respond to short-term contingencies over long-term contingencies, and I feel like here there's this assumption that people are not going to respond to short-term contingencies anymore. And everyone's going to suddenly be under the understanding that we're all like playing the long game. That's just not human nature.
But I think that's exactly that's why his utopia seems so horrible, is that he is about, like, he doesn't ever say like overcome, like use behaviorism to like build a society and overcome our like base urges and build like good human behavior. But that is seem to be what he's doing. He is biasing rationality.
Yeah. And
I mean, it's pure objective, like pure problem, big O objectivism of just like, this is not how humans work. But again, I don't think it forgives him of this, but human understanding is the fact that we had psychologists at this point is amazing to me. Like what the hell were they doing?
Yeah.
So,
I want to talk a little bit more about some of the learning, some of the educational aspects. I don't necessarily want to talk about the school system in Walden Two, because again, I think it suffers from a lot of the same assumptions that many of the other well-meaning
very little information
managerial roles of like, well, if kids are taught to do all of the meaningful skills and they're taught kind of their social emotional learning components, then they'll just naturally do the things that are interesting to them. And as they're going into jobs, as they're, finding things they like, as they're starting to do work credits, they'll find the things that they want to do, and then they'll get educated and taught in those areas. And there won't be problems of school because we're not reteaching students anything. Everyone is moving forward at the pace that they're supposed to be at. There aren't any grades. A lot of the administrative cruft that possibly creates aversive situations in schools is no longer there, which is one of those kind of ideas that, while in principle I agree, the amount, like you said, Diana, the amount of detail as to exactly how this would work was not enough for me to feel like, yes, this is how education should be. So I
like the outdoor classroom.
Yeah, the outdoor classroom, the learning by doing, I think that spoke to some of the things we talked about in other book clubs or in other, we talk about, well, why do we have to learn the things we learn in our United States schools? Well, because, white men from Europe told us these are the most important things to learn. So having those options, I think, might actually make for more equitable schools in theory, but the practice wasn't quite there. The practice I do want to talk about was the ethical training that children do at the young ages, where they are taught, and this felt to me very much like I think a lot of the directions that some of the social emotional learning curricula are going, in terms of, you can't just tell kids what they're supposed to do and then hope it works, because then it means some kids get it and some don't. We need to actually plan for them to know what are the skills, how would you engage in some of those skills. So maybe not exactly the way they do. I'm trying to find the section in my notes where I did lay out sort of their ethical training component. But I did like it. It kind of felt a little like skills-based training in a way too, of sort of this shaping procedure with some behaviors you wouldn't think too much of in terms of like, waiting and, not having jealousy of others, I thought that was just very, I don't know, that felt a little more, here we go. So they had like a whole scope and sequence. And really that idea of we mostly just sort of let like kids do things and we assume that they'll just handle it and the strong ones will make it through and the weak ones won't make it through, but they were weak, so who cares about them anyway? That's sort of that idea of they just have to deal, like kids are going to have to learn to deal with it. And then rather than just dealing with it and hoping all kids eventually learn it, which we know that they all do not, because not all children are exactly the same, that idea of selection is an education. It's crops of brave men will always be small and the waste enormous. In Walden Two, we have a different objective. We make every man a brave man. They all come over the barriers. We control adversity to build strength, and we do it deliberately in order to prepare for adversities which are beyond control. And I just really liked that theme of what if we planned for things that were going to be hard for everybody so that people were already equally, rather than at some point, some people will just handle things. And when they can't handle it, we'll assume it's a problem with them rather than a lack of practice or training or, moving beyond like the inherent differences in how we learn and what we can and cannot tolerate. And so that scope and sequence, again, it's a little basic in terms of the presentation where, you have the kids, they get everything they need when they're babies. So they never should be upset as infants other than basic communication, or if they get sick, which they almost never do because they use filters and all sorts of stuff and parents can't see them. No one can come into the nursery without, being healthy. And then they just keep changing the environment slowly. So they have like that lollipop and they're like, oh, you've got this lollipop. Anyone who doesn't eat their lollipop or lick the sugar off the lollipop will get it later. So we should probably hide it. And now kids go run and hide their lollipop. So it's out of sight, out of mind. And then they teach the children to do that on their own. Of like, if you don't want to have temptation in front of you, felt like the marshmallow test a little bit. Yeah. Like if you don't want to have temptation in front of you, you should put it away. And then they teach the children to attend to their own behavior. How do you feel right now with the lollipop in front of you or away? Which again, I think did lend itself to some of this kind of mindful, some proto-mindfulness type ideas of dealing with adversity and then repeating it until it is something that they're very comfortable with, that they're able to talk about being comfortable, almost like, shaping or successive approximations with sort of anxiety treatments. And they do it with like waiting for food. And then some kids get food earlier.
That
so teaching them of like,
though.
That did seem weird. Like you're not going to get that one past the school board, but the general idea of these are things that will happen. What if we taught kids what to do, how to do, why to do, let them sort of have their own private event. They don't use private events in the book, but those private events and label their own private events on it. Like what could that teach? And always keeping it within the tolerance level of the children, making sure what they get is escape from the petty emotions, which eat the heart out of the unprepared. So again, I liked the themes there of what if we, rather than just assuming that bad things happen and only the strong will survive, which was more predominant in education then, though is still, I think, a component of education, at least in the West now, what if we actually taught the skills to deal with adversity? And what if we gave scaffolding to all students rather than just hoping that they weren't dealing with a level of adversity that was beyond their control and then bemoaning the fact that they couldn't do it? So again, do we need to dip lollipops and stuff? Like you're not going to get that in the schools. And that's really simplistic view of it. But I liked that idea. That did really speak to me as something that I've seen somewhat in schools. So I would love to continue that idea of if we're going to do more social emotional learning, and I think our schools are more interested in talking about social emotional learning, we looked at it as a form of, explicit instruction. We looked at it as a form of, maybe paired with some mindfulness. So I did like that. That felt very, I don't know if it was forward thinking at the time contextually, but it seemed very modern in a way. Maybe not the details, but the overall process.
It really seemed like a very simplified version of Montessori, which, again, contextually had, at this point in history, risen and fallen. By the 20s and 30s, the Montessori method in America had really declined, and we don't see the revival of it until the 50s. But felt very Montessori-esque in all of this, especially just the way, that like the children are always like sort of visible and accessible and do have that sense of like self-control in the like internal sense, but also that like we're in a society and just because someone's observing you shouldn't change your behavior. So, it just seemed to be an adoption of a lot of Montessori's ideas about what a good school is.
Yeah, and kind of maybe pair with some post-vocational studies. I didn't get a sense of, well, why would you go do, what was it, like science in the slaughterhouse and in the dairy? Like, are you assigned there? Are you just like, I love killing animals. Can I go to the slaughterhouse to do my science? Like, they didn't get into some of that piece, which always makes me worry that as much as they're talking about equality, is there tracking in their educational system? So there wasn't enough detail there. I love that idea of kids getting to explore on their own. However, that is, like you said, Alan, it's not like the Montessori. There's pros and cons to it in terms of Montessori method as being.
No, but I think that's the thing, is that so if you whatever you show a tendency toward at a young age, which again, this is problematic, that is what you're reinforced with access to and participation in. So just because you like something at like age 10, 11, doesn't mean you're not going to change your mind later, which...
I change my mind frequently,
day
to day.
And I don't think they're banned from switching what they... Because there's no curriculum past, 7, 12? I forget which age.
Yeah, but there's also no higher education. Like there is, but they don't talk about it.
Yeah, they say
you'd have to go.
leave.
You'd have to leave and go to another school, right?
Yeah.
Well, they talk about it in the sense of it was hard to get their transcripts sent from Walden Two to whatever university they went to.
Because they didn't have any transcripts.
So some of these ideas definitely would need to be fleshed out a bit. But I think the more explicit teaching of kind of the ethical training component. Well, again, very simplistic. That did feel more like something that, again, similar to some of the community parenting ideas. Or family training, I think you could take some of that and do within our context. You would not need to dismantle the societies that we've built to do some of that work. And I've even seen a lot of it getting done more and more and more, and that being more of a push after, post-pandemic in schools to acknowledge that the challenges that children are facing and to prepare them for them by actually teaching them a skill rather than just telling them that they shouldn't worry or telling them they shouldn't behave. Yeah. But that was the section I liked. In the book. All right. Well, it is about time for us to wrap up with any final thoughts for future generations who might decide to read Walden Two. I'll kick us off. I again think if you are reading this with the mindset of I would like things to be different than they are, but what could they be like? This book might give you some ideas, but the key ones are going to be more about the thought of experimenting and looking at maximal benefit. You can't take Walden 2 and be like, if I just follow what's in this book, I'll make an amazing community, because you won't. It has been tried and it fails. It is a poor community. You can't compete with the rest of, the reinforcers in society. But that idea of using reinforcement effectively and being willing to think about solutions and then try things rather than always having an answer. I've always kind of felt that was important. And I do always kind of like that small town, sufficiency piece. That seems very attractive, whether or not it is sustainable.
Too. Yeah, I do like that
town idea.
Like, it seems like you can solve problems faster in a smaller community than in a larger community, and maybe take care of everyone better. Or
ostracize those that don't fit in faster and more efficiently.
Truth, but I'm hoping that's not. Hopefully, that's not where we're.
You've been trained to support all the people in your community, so hopefully you won't do that. Will you or will you not?
They don't talk about that. What happens to people that don't participate in this ethic? The
mention of it is, well, of course, if they have things to do and they're doing things that are meaningful, they'll go do their work. But they don't speak to people. What if you physically are not able to do the work that is needed to be done? They don't.
Yeah.
They don't touch that one. Occasionally, Fraser will do, but we would figure it out. We're not without ideas, but then they just don't get into those ideas. But realistically, do you want another 100 pages where they talk about some of those pieces? I don't know. I think 300 was the right amount of pages, or 301 or whatever version.
Could have been a little bit smaller. Could have taken out maybe only one page about the sheep and not like 7 pages about the sheep.
Dan, what about your kind of wrap up thoughts?
Well, I guess I would be interested to see if there are some pieces of this idea that we could interpret for a modern day societal perspective with some... It would be an interesting thought exercise. right, to do something like that. I think it would look quite different, though, from what Skinner had envisioned at this point in time.
And then, Alan, any last words of wisdom?
I mean, I just don't think that there is a lot to be learned from this in terms of like building a society. I think there's a lot to be learned about Skinner that then you can then apply to your understanding of his other works and understand about the context of both that he is working in as a professional, but then also the life he grew up with in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and everything. I wouldn't recommend this work to anybody unless they were going to take a deep dive in understanding like the mind of B.F. Skinner, which I think every behaviorist should do at some point because it's foundational to our field, but not necessarily right out of the box, and definitely not someone who's just wants a casual understanding of behaviorism in any sense.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
this is not a primer on behavior analysis. No.
Yeah.
I think they talk a lot in this book about control, right? And where that control is going to come from, and whether your behavior is underneath control, whether we're operating with absolute freedom. And so those are good conversations, good philosophical conversations to have. I think the book we read, was it Nudge?
The Nurture Effect,
It was the Nurture Effect. Sorry.
Yeah.
The Nurture Effect in its beginning chapters does a better job of talking about the ways in which our behavior is controlled and governed by societal rules, whether those are established organically or they're put into place by governmental figures, how those control behavior and how there's never going to be an absence of control, right? Our behavior is under control. It's a matter of whether that control has been designed in such a way that it's beneficial for the folks who are experiencing it, or it's been, drawn up in such a way that it benefits those who already have power. And I think the Nurture Effect gives us that perspective in a better way that this book could have benefited from.
Yeah.
That's my actual final takeaway.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our Walden 2 book club. For folks who are listening to this through their Patreon feed, thank you so much for subscribing. I'm going to give you the second. I'm going to give everyone the second secret code word right now. If you're just getting this on the free feed about like a year or so from now, thank you also for listening. The second secret code word is blueberry. BLUEBERRY. It's a fruit. You eat it. They probably grow a lot of them in Walden too, right? Or they ship them in, but probably grow them so that they can generalize the different foods the kids eat with a little story next to all the dishes. I like that. I forgot to mention that part. The cafeteria. They have a little thing. This is where your food came from. So again, if you're listening on our Patreon feed, don't forget to go to the original post, which there'll be a link in the show notes, to get your code for 2 CEs at no additional charges. A big thank you for being a patron. And if you're listening to this on the free feed, well, thank you for finding this. You might want to go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track and subscribe so you too can get access to that code word. Otherwise, you can click on the link in the show notes to go to our main page, get CEUs, and just get CEUs as you normally do with your code words. Thanks to Jackie and Diana and to Alan for being here and talking so long about Walden 2. We're not quite sure how long yet because we had some audio fun, but we'll
definitely long enough.
Yeah, long enough was true. We will be back in the fall.
To a whole Mozart symphony by now.
Those are only 50 minutes long.
I know those by heart as well. One does.
We're longer than a Walden 2 performance on our podcast. So we will be back with our fall book club in the fall, all on supervision. But until next time, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.